So we've created our lovely patterns here in Adobe Illustrator, and we want to take a look at them on a more kind of architectural setting. I'm going to start by drawing an interior elevation. And most interior elevations are rectangles, so I'm going to click on the rectangle tool. But we do have to draw it to scale. And I'm going to draw an elevation at 1/4 inch scale, maybe 10-foot high ceilings, I don't know, about 24 feet wide. Well, at 1/4 inch scale, you just divide those numbers of feet by 4 to get the dimension in inches. So that's going to be about 6 inches by 2.5 inches high. Well, to draw a rectangle like that, just click once instead of clicking and dragging, and you'll end up with a little menu that asks you, how big do you want this rectangle to be? And I can just type in the number 6, and I'll hit tab to type in 2.5. And OK, and it inserts a rectangle right where I clicked. And there you go, it's a beautiful interior elevation. And you might say, that's a little bigger pattern than I intended. I drew the pattern at full scale, and that's how it's drawing it here. But we also have to reduce the pattern to be at 1/4 inch scale. So I'll just right click on the pattern, choose Transform, Scale. Now, my screen is going bananas because I'm scaling the whole object. I want to transform just the patterns. Okay, see how I'd uncheck all of these other options. And then I just need to decide what the scale is going to be. Well, I happen to know that 48, 1 to 48 is the scale factor for reducing to 1/4 inch scale. It's just a matter of mathematics. 1/4 of an inch, there's 4 per inch, and times 12 inches per foot. Gosh, I wish we would go metric. It'd just be so much easier. But alas, we are stuck with an old imperial system. Anyway, we can type in 100 divided by 48, 48, as the scale, and you'll come up with a number which is 2.083 or something. Anyway, I'll click OK. And now you can see that the scale has been reduced quite significantly, and that is our pattern at 1/4 inch scale. It would be nice to draw in a little wall base here on my interior elevation. So I'm going to deselect the rectangle. And I had drawn this with 2 points as the line weight for the exterior perimeter of the interior elevation. That, of course, is really nice to have that dark line. So let's use that same stroke for the wall base, but let's choose white as the fill color. And I'll just draw my rectangle. You'll notice, by the way, that it does snap to the object. So it's awfully handy when it does that. It kind of makes it look a little neater. You don't want a sloppy interior elevation. But what I do want to do is get rid of this top line. You see how the top line is awfully dark. There's a special tool called the lasso tool where you can grab kind of individual pieces of paths, and I'm just going to tap the delete button to get rid of it. To draw back in that line at a lighter line weight, though, it's a little tricky because if you use the pen or pencil tool, they will continue the same path and take that line weight. So I'll need to use just a line, and I can set the stroke here in advance or afterwards. And I'll just click once to start it and click again to finish. And there we go. We have a nice interior elevation. To liven up our interior elevation, we can absolutely take a look at getting a piece of furniture in there. The easiest way to do that is to just go on good old internet and Google it up. Although, interesting enough, I prefer to use Bing just because it opens the image directly in a new tab. Google doesn't actually do that. And one of the things you should use are keywords when you search. So I searched for couch with a white background. You can also use transparent background or even alpha channel. And front view is another keyword that you can use. And I came up with this pattern. You see this checkerboard in the background. That is actually kind of a universal symbol for this being transparent. Funny thing is, even though I typed in white as a background, when you open it, sometimes it will open with a black background on Windows computers. Anyway, just right-click on the image and choose Save Image As. You can actually copy and paste it in directly to your drawing. However, sometimes that does end up being a little bit large in the background. Back in my drawing, I can just go to File, Place, or Control-Shift-P if you're into that. Browse for your couch. And I usually leave the Show Import Options checked just to see if there are any import options. In this case, because it's a single object and not a PDF, I can just click and drag. When I release, it will place the couch. Now, I'm kind of guessing at the size of this couch, so maybe I should put a person in here to see if I've got it kind of the right scale. Now, I know this is about 10 feet tall. To place the person, I just do the exact same process, place object. This person is going to be about 5'8" or so. I think 5'8" is the average height of an American male. Well, if this is 10 feet, he should be just a little bit taller than twice the, or than half the height. So I can use the grips here to transform him. Just remember, as you resize this, holding down Shift will force it to stay in the same proportion. If you don't hold down Shift, it can be pretty ugly pretty fast. Anyway, then I can slide him next to the couch and see if I like the way they look, and I think they look okay. You can even select both and apply one of those effects that we talked about before. I'm going to try adding a drop shadow. Let's see if we like the way that looks. Oh yeah, that looks pretty good. And maybe we'll use the multiply blending mode. This, by the way, is a way to kind of transform the way objects interact with the layers below. You can also just use a color or darkness. Either one will work fine. One other way that you can get furniture into your projects, especially if it's simple furniture like an ottoman, is you can just draw it. We have a rectangle tool. We can set the stroke to be something nice and light, and ottomans tend to be pretty rectangular. Let's see, I'll just draw something over here. Zoom in on it a little. Now, one thing you'll find is that your texture, if it's like mine, has some transparency to it. So I'm going to make the fill white for now, and we'll see in a few moments how to change it so that you can use it with our pattern. Anyway, and I tend to use a lot of this holding down the Alt key, clicking and dragging as I'm creating objects. I don't know why. I find that it's just easier. I can make objects that match in size. But by all means, you can just continue to draw, say, rectangles for the wall, the feet on the object here. And there you have an object that is pretty easy to use. In fact, I can even select it. Now in Illustrator, one bummer is that when you select things, they tend to select everything that's behind it. So I'm going to hold down Shift and deselect everything in the background. Now I just have my ottoman, and I'm going to turn it into a group just to make my life easier. And maybe I'll give it a drop shadow too. So let's start with our ottoman. We can touch up the geometry a little bit. I'm going to use the selection tool to double click on the group that I created. And let's see, let's start by modifying the feet ever so slightly. I can use the direct selection tool, and I can click on individual anchor points and modify those. Maybe give myself a little bit of splay in my feet on the object. Zoom out a little. Another fun thing you can do is kind of soften the edges here of the ottoman. I'll use my selection tool again and click and drag on one of these little handles, and these will soften the edges. Now, if I want to get even more subtle control, for example, let's say this top one, I want to soften the corners, but I want to have the top a little softer than the bottom. I'll have to zoom in a little here. And I can actually grab individual handles here. If I just click on it once, it selects it, and now I can soften the top a whole lot more than I soften the bottom, and that looks actually really nice. This still doesn't solve my problem of painting my pattern onto a solid object. I need to make a white background behind my paint pattern. And the easiest way to do that, I'm going to make a copy of my group. Now, I am inside the group. I'm going to exit the group select it again, and I could Alt-click drag to make a copy. I could also select the base object here, copy it by tapping Control-C, and then I could edit, paste in place, and it will paste an object directly on top of the original object. So now I have my copy, as you can see here. I'll just slide it out of the way. I don't need the drop shadow on it. I can actually go to my appearance menu and just turn off that drop shadow. It's the kind of the easiest way. Then I don't want to paint these legs, so I'm going to double click on this group that I've made, and I'll just delete the legs. I can paint those back in the original, but I can now select the two pieces that I do want to have my textile applied to. So now I've got all I need to get the pattern here. I'll just exit out of that group back to my main layer, select my sort of truncated ottoman, and the way that I can get this scaled pattern onto this ottoman is just select the group, and I'll use the eyedropper tool, slurp up that scaled pattern, and it will apply it to these objects. Now, it did also apply this giant stroke to it, which I don't need, so I'm going to just get rid of that. The other thing that obviously you probably don't want is you don't want to see the background wall color, so I'll want to make that a gray color. The other thing that you can do with these objects is you can go to the transparency menu, and instead of having this normal blending mode, this is something which controls how objects on top of each other behave. You can make it what's called a multiply blending mode. And what this will do, this will allow any line weights to shine through, and if there's any drop shadow or other things, those will also shine through. And there you have it, a beautiful, if somewhat simple, ottoman. So the couch, I'm afraid, is probably not going to be quite as easy to deal with, and the reason is that the geometry is a little more complicated. Now, some things can absolutely be done the same way. So, for example, I can select these two objects here. I can slurp up using the eyedropper tool, the scaled fabric pattern, textile pattern, and of course I can make them both have a blending mode in my transparency menu. That's that multiply blending mode that I mentioned, and that will allow some of the base pattern to kind of seep through. I can also modify the opacity if there is some texture that I want to have come through. Now, the problem that I'm running into is that some of these shapes don't quite fit the object behind them. There are some basic effects that can be used to grace effect, I guess, that I can take a look at here. If we go to the Effect pull-down menu under the Illustrator effects, there's a couple that I happen to like. Bulge is a good one, and Inflate is a good one. And you can apply these multiple times. So for example, if I get the vertical bulge the way I like it, I'm going to use my arrow keys, which you can't see, to nudge it one way or the other. Or I can just fiddle around with the sliders. And then you can apply that. I've applied it twice here, actually. I'm in my appearance menu where I can turn them on and off. And you can see that I can kind of tweak it. It's not perfect by any means, but it's pretty close. Anyway, and then just make sure that you go and make your transparency multiply. I'm going to get rid of my stroke. One last little thing that you can do is add back in the piping that is typical on these sorts of objects. I can use a line here, just a rectangle. In fact, it's just a copy of the original rectangle. And I like to add a kind of funky brush to it. Remember, you can get all these brushes from different places. I think I'm just going to use this hand-drawn one, and you can modify that in a number of ways, but the simplest one is just to change the stroke, make it a little thinner, and this just kind of softens the line a little bit. In fact, you can even type in a much smaller number. I typed in 0.025 here just to get me a really light line weight, but you see how that just kind of softens the edge ever so slightly. Now, one last part of this couch that's a little more difficult than the others is this wedge-shaped piece here, because that is actually in perspective. Now, how do I modify the pattern so that it warps in perspective? Well, the simplest way is when you've painted it on an object, just warp the object and it will squish the pattern down. Now, the only trick is I want this pattern to be cropped to this shape. That's pretty straightforward. You just select them both. Obviously, you have to have drawn them both. And the outline has to be in front of this background image. But once you have that layering in order, just right-click on them and choose Make Clipping Mask. And that will crop your shape around, crop your pattern using the shape you have created. And you can actually come back in here with the direct selection tool and you can modify the cropping. You can even add in anchor points and other things as you want to modify it. One last little trick we can use to really kind of squish the shape that we have drawn to match the object we're trying to cover is one that is one of these more advanced editing tools. This one is called the envelope distort, and you can use a number of different ways, but I'm going to use a mesh. So I've selected my object, I've gone to Object, Envelope Distort, Make with Mesh, and let me just preview what this is going to look like here. This is a mesh which is based on a grid, and it has these little anchor points that we can edit, and they're glued to the pattern below. So I'll click OK. I'll use my direct selection tool to grab these individual anchor points. Whoops, and I have to click on them twice to actually select it. And now I can really start to tweak the look of this object just by dragging these up. And it's obviously not easy to get it in exactly the right way as your object, but you can see you can really kind of modify these pretty subtly. You can even change these Bezier adaptation points here to modify and kind of hug that curve pretty tightly. I can drag this down a little bit, but maybe I'll drag this up a little bit just to get those corners. And this is a way you can kind of subtly modify the geometry of these objects. Again, not perfect. You can spend a lot of time making it perfect, but that's pretty darn close. An alternative to drawing a mask shape and then masking an individual object is you can actually just mask the material. Now, I've selected this rectangle here, and I'm going to go to the transparency menu, and there's an option here called Make Mask. And what you'll see is the material will disappear. And this is kind of, I guess, the reverse of the other technique. Now I can draw using white paint or white color, and anything that I draw will reveal the object. And I can draw using any of my drawing tools. So for example, I could draw a rectangle here to reveal the pattern in this little section. I could also use one of my pen tools. For example, here I'll use the curvy pen, and I'll start to draw the outline here around this very, nice couch, but obviously a little harder to draw if you're really trying to make it as precise as possible. And if you make a mistake, you can even use the eraser tool and clean up the little anchor points that you might have drawn in a mistake. When you're working with these masks, you do have to make sure to click back on the main image so that you can edit it. Now, one other thing I wanted to show you is that you can move the pattern just the same way that we scaled it. Just right-click on the pattern, the object with the pattern, and choose Transform Move. But now, instead of moving the object, the scale of the object, we can just move the pattern. Let's say we want to get one or another of these dots centered in the object. We can just fiddle around with the numbers until we can get it exactly the way we want it. And there we go, more or less centered. And you might be wondering, can I take these techniques that I used in Elevation and draw them in Plan? And yes, indeed you can. And I'm going to go over to my artboards menu here, and I'm going to select this bottom artboard. That's my most recent one. And if I click the new button, it will make a new one that's exactly the same size as the old one. In fact, you can even copy whole artboards with everything on them, but I'm just going to copy it this way. Now, I've copied over some of the graphics from my other view just because I don't want to have to redraw them. But you can see an ottoman in plan is probably a square. It probably has a drop shadow on it. Now, how can I make this look a little more like a floor plan? Well, I can take this exact same rectangle and I'm going to copy and paste it in place. So I've made my copy, placed it behind the original. I can change the size of the object here based on my knowledge of scale, which is I want to make 6-inch walls. So I'll just add 1/4 of an inch onto either side of the object here. Now there are these resize anchor point options here. So the reference point should be the middle. And I can even give this thing some fill that might be more appropriate for poche. Now, floor plans are often kind of partial in nature, so you'll want to have some kind of break line. I have a break line here that you can all borrow. I've got it in a graphic scale and break line drawing that I've created. You can copy and paste them in, pretty easy to use. And I'll just paste it in here and drag it down, and it can break my plan. See how it's got a little white area to it so that it will block out anything behind it. And this is also a 1/4 inch scale drawing. And then it's just a matter of you can absolutely use the same techniques you did before. We can load in a image file that we can find online of a couch in plan. In fact, I can even draw in some walls onto my plan. A fun way to do that, select the inner part of the floor plan here and use the eraser tool, but double click on the eraser tool and you can change the angle of the eraser, but you can also make the end of the eraser square. And if I choose 18 point, that is actually equivalent to 1/4 of an inch. I'll click OK, and I'm going to hold down Shift, and that will force horizontal drawing. And now I can draw in what looks suspiciously like a wall. And there we go. Now my couch is in its own little alcove. So now here in InDesign, we will quickly see why it's so handy to have all of our drawings in one Illustrator file. I'm just going to go to File, Place, and browse for my Illustrator file. Make sure you have Show Import Options selected, but uncheck Replace Selected Item, basically because I don't know what I had selected already. Click Open, and it will give us a preview of all of the pages we've created. There's 2, 3, 4, 5. So we got each of our patterns, the elevation, and the plan. I don't want the first page, so I'm going to actually tell InDesign just to give me pages 2 through 7. And I don't like to have a transparent background because I may have some kind of background on my board. The other thing you can do, you can have it trim to a number of different elements. If I tell it to trim it to the artwork, you see how it crops this view so that it doesn't have all the extra white space. Now, of course, I can always trim it when I get into InDesign. Either way works. I'll click OK. And now I can click to place my objects. Notice, by the way, I'm just clicking once. This will insert the drawings at the original scale that they were drawn at. This is very important. If you click and drag when you place your objects, it will resize them. And we don't want that. We want to see the original size pattern. We went through all that effort to draw them that way, so let's take advantage of it. Now, when you print, you'll have everything to the correct size. And of course, I have this graphic scale, which I have used when I am creating scale drawings. It's very important, even if I were to resize this, which you shouldn't, but if you did resize it on your board, the graphic scale would at least indicate the correct size of the drawing.